This is Caroline Kelly from the Career Center. We have with us today Phil Lee, who is a graduate of Hopkins, class of '83, here to talk a little bit about opportunities in medical devices. Phil would like for this session to be more interactive, so please feel free to take yourself off of mute and to jump in with questions along the way. He'd be happy to stop and pause and take the conversation off course if need be. Thanks so much, Phil, and we're looking forward to hearing a little bit more about your experiences.
Thanks for that introduction. And yeah, so it's been a long time since I was at Hopkins. It looks like it was probably, if I do the math a little bit, do some little subtraction, and it was over 30 years ago since I graduated from Hopkins. And I actually was at Hopkins a while back to give another talk that was kind of similar to this about opportunities in the industry. But I think that I was probably only about, I think I was like 30 at the time, so maybe my perspective has changed a little bit since that time, but yeah, some of the stuff has not changed, and so I'm going to try to share that with you, with my experiences in having been working in the industry for, over 30 years. So next slide. Carolyn, you still there? Okay, there we go. All right, so I think you guys are mostly familiar with the big companies that are in the field in the space. I actually have worked in a couple of fairly large medical device companies. Here, you got the list here. Some of the more common ones are Medtronic, Boston Scientific. The other ones that are not pure medical device players are like General Electric. Johnson & Johnson, they have some medical device. They have some involvement in, I think, drug pumps, although maybe they're not in it anymore. But they have divisions that deal with medical devices, and same with General Electric. Okay, and some other opportunities. If you can go to the next slide. There are opportunities working at hospitals, universities, and another thing that's kind of quite different, of course, is medical device startups. So if you go back to the previous slide, Carolyn. Okay, so I also worked at a place called Advanced Bionics. Advanced Bionics is located here in Southern California. It's a suburb, Santa Clarita. It was a smaller company when I joined, but I'd worked at Medtronic as an engineer for about 7 years, did a number of different projects there. I worked on a project at the last moment. It was something called cardiomyoplasty. And what we're trying to do is to use the back muscle of people who had heart failure. And this was a way to treat chronic heart failure by taking the back muscle and wrapping it around the heart and providing assist. So they were doing clinical studies at the time, but that project did not actually pan out. It was actually a pretty difficult project, I think, to make work. But the patients who we were treating, or who were getting this treatment, I wasn't personally treating them, but the patients who were getting this treatment were patients who had chronic heart failure, and they really didn't have much of an alternative except maybe possibly wait for an artificial heart. And it's not easy to get, well, either an artificial heart, maybe a bridge to transplant, waiting for someone to give them a heart, basically. So you'd have to get a donor. There weren't enough donors, so most people who had chronic heart failure would eventually they would die from that. So I worked on that for about 7.5 years, and then decided to go to law school at that point, because I was working with a number of patent attorneys who said, well, would you be interested in going into patent law, because there's actually a lot of need for patent attorneys in the field. And I said, oh, that sounds quite interesting, let me give that a try. So then I went to law school. After law school, I joined a law firm in New York City, and I was there for about 2 years practicing patent law, mainly doing patent litigation. And so I was there for a while, and then I decided, oh, maybe I didn't really want to be in New York City because I just had a child and wanted to get maybe a little more space. So then I moved to Palo Alto with the same law firm, but they had a Palo Alto office. And I was mainly I did some litigation, but then I did more patent prosecution, which is more transactional work to get patents. You know, you're interacting with the U.S. Patent Office and, you know, sending in arguments as to why the invention is something that should be allowed and issued as a patent. So I did that for about 2 or 3 years, and then finally decided, well, you know, I got to make a decision. Do I want to be continue to work in a law firm, or do I want to maybe go back to a corporate setting like at Medtronic? And so I decided, you know, it would be time to go in-house because I wanted to. I missed, I guess, the industry setting because I'd worked at Medtronic for 7.5 years, and at that point I decided, yeah, I think I'm going to go back to industry. And there was an opening at Advanced Bionics here in California. It was a smaller company. It was maybe about 400 or 500 people at the time, as opposed to Medtronic, which, you know, when I left, it was like $1 billion company. But Advanced Bionics was a startup, and it was started by a man. His name was Alfred Mann, and he's actually fairly well known in the medical device industry because he founded 3 different companies. The first company he founded, I believe, was I think it was Pacesetters. Pacesetters was a pacemaker company that he sold to Siemens, and Siemens then eventually transferred over to St. Jude Medical. And then he also founded another company called MiniMed. MiniMed is artificial pumps. Well, not artificial, they're pumps basically. Obviously they're artificial. They're pumps basically to deliver some kind of drug. You know, they can be drugs like baclofen, used to treat spinal cord and pain, essentially. They can also possibly be used for delivering insulin. So he founded MiniMed, and that got sold to Medtronic a while back, and I think it was like a multi-billion-dollar deal. And then he started up Advanced Bionics probably about maybe 15 years ago or so. And this company he founded to treat deafness. It's basically not a hearing aid, but a device that's implanted in the cochlea. So the electrode goes in the cochlea and stimulates the nerves in the cochlea to provide a sensation of hearing for people who are deaf. So the patient population for that particular business was infants or children who were never able to hear, but who had an intact, you know, nerves in the cochlea, so that they could still, you know, they were still plastic enough that they would be able to hear if you were to stimulate the cochlea. The other patient population are adults who at one time were able to hear, but lost their hearing at some point, you know, because the inner ear, they had some mechanical deficiencies. So again, in that situation, if you were to stimulate the cochlea directly, they would be able to hear. A lot of times, if they're adults and never were able to hear, then they were not candidates to get this device. But Advanced Bionics was, they also made a spinal cord stimulator to treat, you know, pain. So Boston Scientific bought Advanced Bionics in 2004, and you know, I basically transitioned from Advanced Bionics to Boston Scientific. At some point, there was a decision made to jettison the cochlear business into a separate business, and they eventually got bought by, I think, a Swiss company called Sonova Holdings. But the other part of Advanced Bionics, which was the spinal cord stimulation, stayed with Boston Scientific. So they're continuing to work on that, and that sort of was the major device for the neuromodulation business at Boston Scientific. So I was at Boston Scientific until 2014, working on the spinal cord stimulator, and later on they also developed a brain, basically a very similar system that would be used to stimulate the brain. So it's their deep brain stimulator to treat Parkinson's and essential tremor. So again, that was part of their whole neuromodulation business. So I'm just wondering if anyone has any questions at this point. You still there? Hello?
Yes, we're still here, Phil.
Okay. All right, so there's no questions. Okay, next slide. Okay, as I said, you can work at hospitals, you can work at universities, but the major difference at hospitals is you're not going to be working on cutting-edge medical devices. You're probably going to be doing other kinds of things that, so as a biomedical engineer, for example, you could get a job at hospitals, but I'm not certain exactly, it's not maybe quite as interesting because you're not going to be doing cutting-edge work. Universities, there's probably some jobs, and you could be a researcher, but I probably won't speak too much to that because I haven't got too much experience in that. The other thing, of course, is startups, which we'll talk about a little more going, a little later in the slides. So next slide. All right, so what are some of the technical areas? Well, I talked about them a little bit. I think I focus more on neuromodulation because that's been my experience. But of course, there are other types of areas that are medical device related. For example, orthopedic implants. That's more mechanical and materials. You got hip implants, you got knee implants, joints. There are things, there are stents that are used for cardiac, cardiac field to open up vessels, when you have blockages. That's a big area, although recently there's been kind of a contraction, I think, in the use of stents because there was kind of a crackdown by the federal government on stents being used in many cases where there was possibly where they didn't need to be used, and so I think they were more popular at one time. They're now being I think the selection criteria for using stents is probably better because there was that crackdown. Heart valves, there's replacement heart valves. In the old days, with Medtronic and St. Jude Medical, there were these mechanical heart valves that were used, made out of I think some carbon composites. Now I think they're going more toward tissue valves, using porcine tissue valves that are treated. And what else is there? Okay, there's diagnostic areas. You can, if you want to consider imaging technologies to be part of medical devices or in the medical device industry, yes, there's various types of imaging technologies, MRI, CAT scans, and all that. So there's a lot of need for biomedical engineers there and for other types of engineers. The other thing is prosthetics. Using artificial limbs. The Alfred Mann Foundation is a little bit involved with that. We got a system right now that is able to control a prosthetic device using the same, I guess, thinking that you would use in order to operate your own hand and control your own hand. But that's all I'm going to say right now for that. So next slide. So where are the medical device companies located? Well, the biggest concentration is Minnesota because Medtronic started there, like sometime in the 1950s. So they were kind of the mother of a lot of the medical device companies that grew in Minnesota. And St. Jude Medical is one that kind of is a big one. I think they were former Medtronic employees who started their own companies. But there's a whole slew of medical device companies in Minnesota, so they call that Medical Alley as opposed to like Silicon Valley, you know, in San Francisco, Palo Alto. The other places where there's a fair number of medical device companies are like in Massachusetts, Boston. There's medical device companies located in Texas. You know, there's and the other places are Northern and Southern California. So we're talking about Silicon Valley, San Jose, Sunnyvale, San Francisco, and the other places actually here in LA and also in San Diego. There's a number of medical device companies located here as well. And what other places? I think Salt Lake City, Utah, because University of Utah has a pretty good program. They think there's a number of medical device companies located there. There's some located in Chicago, some located also in New York, New Jersey. So basically, it's pretty spread out now. I mean, at one time, it was concentrated in Minnesota, but I think more recently, you know, you're going to be finding medical device companies all over the United States. So if you don't like the cold weather in Minnesota, you know, there are other options, you know, San Francisco, LA, so forth. Next slide. Now, I should mention that, you know, depending on what location that you go to, of course, you know, the cost of living is pretty different. So if you go to like Silicon Valley, housing and all that is pretty expensive, and of course New York City housing is pretty expensive. LA, different parts of it, you know, some places are more reasonable than others. Like Santa Clarita has pretty reasonable housing compared to the rest of California, Southern and Northern California. But it's probably still more expensive than, you know, relative to say Minnesota or Texas. So that's something to be aware of when you relocate to some location. All right, now getting a job in a medical device company. I think that there are probably more opportunities for entry-level positions in bigger companies like Boston Scientific or Medtronic. I mean, it's still possible to get an entry-level position, I think. Most of those, the avenues are probably try to get some sort of an internship. And if you get an internship, you know, you got a leg up, because if you do a good job during the summer or during, you know, the school year, you know, it would probably be a lot easier for you to then get a permanent position if you do a good job. Because at that point, you've got some experience, you know, you're working on a project, and they may then hire you permanently. And I've seen that at Boston Scientific when I was working at the neuromodulation division. I didn't see too much of that at Medtronic, but and they are getting some feedback here.
So,
Yes,
can you hear us?
Hello?
Hi, can you hear us now? So,
Yeah, I can still hear you.
there's a lot of feedback happening.
Yeah. So most medical devices require some experience in order to get the position. They usually like to hire people who already have some experience either in another medical device company or even in a different industry, as long as, you know, you have some experience. It's probably easier to get a job with a master's degree or a PhD. They will then hire you directly from those programs, you know, when you graduate, because your master's or your PhD is kind of like the experience. But if you have just a bachelor's degree, you may want to get a job anywhere in any technology company, and then you might go into a medical device company. It may also be possible to get some experience, like in a hospital setting, and then maybe get a job in a company. Okay, next slide. You pretty much major in any kind of major, but certain majors are probably easier to get a job later on. There's always a need, for example, for electrical engineers, mechanical engineers, maybe to a lesser degree physics, and certainly biomedical engineers are well received in medical device companies. If you're a biomedical engineer, though, it's pretty hard to get a job in some other kind of industry. That's the kind of downfall. You're going to be a biomedical engineering major. If you're an electrical engineer, mechanical engineer, or a computer science major, you're pretty much going to be able to get jobs in any industry where that kind of is. That's the positive of the other engineering majors. The other majors that you could go into are business, accounting, people in health and finance, and you know, other majors are fine too. There are some, but it's not as because the demand for engineers is probably greater. It's hard to find electrical engineers and computer science majors because there's so many jobs, and find more jobs than there needs the number of people who have those majors and skills. But speaking to Boston Scientific, if you look at management, it seemed like the people who actually became presidents of each of the divisions were actually former salespeople. Yeah, they liked salespeople going into upper management. And sales, you can major in anything. You can be an English major, you can be a history major. Some of them, of course, were engineers. But, of course, you have to have a certain kind of personality to go into sales. Now, at Medtronic, it was different. I noticed that in Medtronic, those who were managers tended to be, many of them tended to be engineers. I remember, for example, the CEO of Medtronic at the time that I was working there. His name was William George, or Bill George. I think he was an engineer initially, and then I think he got his MBA. So depending on what the culture is, they may prefer engineers, they may prefer other than engineers. So there's always, you know, I guess it depends on what company you're in. Okay, next slide. So why is the major important? Well, I sort of touched on that. Some majors, it's a lot easier to get a job because there's just more job openings. And engineering majors, it's a pretty good entree into medical device companies, heavily engineering oriented. I mean, for example, pacemakers, there's a lot of electrical components to those. And there's also software because you have to program the external hardware that programs the simulators. You need to have good grades to get one of these jobs? I would say probably no. I mean, as long as you graduate and you have some experience maybe, you're probably going to be able to get a job pretty easily. I will say that grades are important, though. If you're planning on going to grad school, you still have to have reasonably good grades, I think, in order to get into some graduate programs. I don't really know right now at Hopkins what the average grades are and how the grades are. I would say that if you have reasonably good grades, like B average, maybe even a high C+ average, you might be able to, you probably would be able to get into some grad school. Grad programs, unfortunately, have a very good impression of Johns Hopkins graduates, that even if your grades are somewhat lower than some other, other colleges, you have a pretty good shot of getting into graduate programs. So, and of course, if you're thinking of other fields like medicine, your grades are probably going to be more important. But once again, if you're majoring in something like biomedical engineering, they might give you a little bit of leeway that grades aren't as high as other majors, because I know that Hopkins is pretty rigorous. So, yeah, grades. I don't think I ever got asked what my grades were when I applied to jobs. When you're looking for a position, they look at your major, they look at what college you went to, and maybe if you got experience. But I guess if you have good grades and you put it down, you got on a team and all that. But if you don't, then you don't put it down. It seems you care that much about it. So yeah, for grad school, grades are important. So you still have to be concerned about the best grade you can. But maybe not to the nth degree. What's really important, and what I found out the last time I gave this talk, is the skills you think weren't that important in school become really important, actually. And that's like general writing skills and speaking skills. These skills, you don't get too much of that sometimes in college. You do a couple of presentations, you write a couple of term papers, but they become really important once you start working. You got to write reports, you got to write emails, and you got to write emails that are succinct and that are persuasive. And they're clear, so that you can convey your information to others. So presentation skills and writing skills are very important. So when you're taking those English classes and your political science classes, they just know that they are going to be important to you in the future. Yeah. The other thing that's really important, and that's been kind of the hot topic in the last couple of years, the last 5 or 10 years, 5 years, is they've been talking about something called emotional intelligence. And if you're more, if you're interested in learning more about that, you can go on Wikipedia. There's some articles about that. But emotional intelligence is a concept that has been around for a while. I think there was a 1964 paper by somebody named Michael Beldock, but it became more popularized with a book that was written by Daniel Goleman. It was titled Emotional Intelligence, a 1995 book. And what this talks about is, emotional intelligence as opposed to IQ. Well, IQ, that's something that's kind of innate intelligence. Well, emotional intelligence is a little bit different. Emotional intelligence is not necessarily innate, although some people seem to have an innate emotional intelligence to begin with. They just have a tendency for it. But emotional intelligence is, we'll give you the definition of Wikipedia. It says the capacity to be aware of, control, and I think they control one's emotions and to handle interpersonal relationships and be empathetic. So these are things that you probably acquire, experience you acquire over time. But you can take courses to identify what areas are important, and then you intentionally try to improve those areas, rather than to wait 30 years and sort of get that experience over time you can identify areas that you want to improve and actively and intentionally try to improve those areas. And if you do, I think that would help your career quite a bit. So, I mean, what are some examples? This is like, dealing with individuals. Understanding what you really want to do. Some people just don't seem to have an idea what they really want to do 5 years from now, 10 years from now, what they want to do for the future, what they are good at, and what motivates them. That's part of emotional intelligence. The other thing is having empathy for other people, because if you have empathy for other people, you understand what other people's needs are. You have then the ability to fill their needs. And that becomes important, because if you're able to fulfill people's needs, people recognize that maybe you're a pretty good worker. If you can fill their needs even before they even know it, and you exceed people's expectations, you can be, that will help you become successful in a corporate setting. I guess it'll probably help you in any kind of setting, even in a startup setting. So some people say that emotional intelligence is worth twice as much as IQ. I don't know how to quantify that. I don't know, but I think that emotional intelligence is important. Generally speaking, in the old days, we talked about emotional intelligence as like common sense, ability to be empathetic, but now they got a word for it, or a phrase, emotional intelligence. So, next slide.
So this is Caroline. I think that your microphone and your phone are on at the same time, so there's a little bit of echoing going on. Could you potentially turn off the microphone on your computer?
Okay. Okay. I just turned it off. I muted it. No?
Yeah, it should be in the bottom right corner that you can hit the microphone off.
Yeah, I turned it off. But for some reason it's still, maybe there is a phone.
Maybe it's the phone.
Okay, but you said that there's a how to turn the microphone on.
Okay. Do you want to try the microphone on your computer and hang the phone up?
I don't know whether my microphone is actually on or not.
Let me try one thing. So, can you hear us now? Phil?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you. There's a lot of feedback. If you could dial in and maybe just mute yourself on the microphone, that might help.
Maybe the microphone is on. I'm gonna hang up and redial again. Okay?
Okay, sounds good.
Oh, wait a minute. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, good. So looks like the microphone is on.
Okay, great. Go ahead. Sorry about that.
So let's feedback now, right?
Yes.
Oh, good. Sorry about all that. It was pretty difficult to have the feedback. All right. So the one important thing about EQ is that unlike IQ, which is pretty much fixed, EQ obviously can be changed. You just need to identify the areas where you can improve, and you can always improve. You have to consciously decide that you're going to do certain things, and then you can improve it. It's going to get better. Like you deal with situations, you can improve it. That's the good news about EQ. So IT can't do too much. Okay, next slide. All right, one of the observations I guess I have, a lot of things that we learn in college, you're never going to need to know the details of a lot of stuff that you get in college. Sometimes, I would say that 80% of what you learn in college, you're never going to ever use again. You will maybe use about 20% of the things you learn in college. For example, you know, obviously if you're a computer science major, you're probably going to have a pretty good, a lot of the courses you're taking, they're going to have pretty good applicability. But as a biomedical engineer, I found that a lot of courses I took didn't apply directly to, you know, the job, because the job required different kinds of details and different skills. For example, I don't think I really used very much calculus. You take calculus, you take differential equations. You know, I don't think I ever used those things that I learned in those courses. What you do learn, though, is general skills. Well, okay, maybe physiology, that was a useful course because you needed to know things about the heart. You know, you need some background material for that. But for the most part, you know, I would say 80% of the stuff I learned detail-wise was not, you know, was never used. But general applicability, you have to be able to learn new tasks, you know, get new information, digest new information, and analyze new information, and be able to use it. So those are the tasks that you're really learning in college, not that, you know, it's not that the details are important. You have to be persistent with problems that arise, you know, when you're working on a project. You know, problems always arise in every single project that you're working on, almost without exception. And you have to be able to deal with it and be creative and come up with solutions. The other thing that's really important is you got to be able to work with others. You have to work in teams. You almost always work in teams, you know, when you're working in a company setting, and even in a startup, you're going to be working with other people. And you're going to be working with people not only within the company, but people outside the company. So that's something you have to develop, and college doesn't always necessarily prepare you for that. I mean, you can go through college, I think, and just kind of be holed up in the library for most of your time and not do too much. I know that other folks, you know, they will engage in, you know, with certain groups and activities, and I think that's always good. If you can find one or two things that you could do other than just studying, working with other people and finding something you enjoy, that's always a good thing to do. But I know that in certain majors, because the course load is so heavy, you know, there can be a tendency where you don't want to be doing too much other than just doing your homework and just keeping up with your work. But maybe that little the extra that you do to try to get those super grades, you know, maybe it's not worth it in the end. It's better just to go and do other activities and learn, you know, collaborate with others, and that might actually be better in the long run. Next slide. So there's not too many rules. I mean, there's a myriad of rules once you're in a company, and different companies have different cultures, so they have different rules. But, you know, maybe some overarching things about working in a company to succeed. You know, make sure you exceed expectations. You know, and that's very broad, I guess. A broad directive. You know, there's a lot of little things you do to make that happen. For example, you know, you need to be creative. You need to be persistent and all that to exceed expectations. But if you do that, you'll be successful. And the other thing is, remember that working in a company is a team effort. You're assigned maybe one task, and then there might be some cross-functional stuff where someone will ask you about something else, and you ask another person to help you with your task. So you have to be able to work with others, be resourceful and use resources within the company, including people, to help you, and also be supportive of other people. I would say that, yeah, so go to the next slide. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about startups. I guess startups are a completely different thing. It's a different animal than, you know, working in a company. You have to, well, if you join a startup as an employee, I guess it's kind of like being in a company. But usually the culture is quite different than a large company like Medtronic or Boston Scientific, which is somewhat more regimented and a lot more rules. In a startup, if you join as an employee, you're going to probably be wearing a lot of different hats. It won't be quite as regimented, and you'll be expected to do a lot because sometimes there aren't a lot of people to do it. And maybe there won't be a lot of rules and a lot of regulations. Now, being a founder of a startup is an entirely different thing. If you want to start your own startup, you have to be of a certain mentality. First of all, you have to come up with a good idea. And most people will have a good idea. In your lifetime, most people will have at least 3 really good ideas, and possibly even more. But most people, you know, they'll have an idea. They say, oh, this is an idea, but then they really won't follow up on it. It'll just sort of go away. And so if you are thinking about a startup, you know, you have to be cognizant of when you come up with an idea and decide that you really want to do something with it. Yeah, so, you know, if you are interested in a startup, you don't dismiss ideas. And the other thing, too, is expectations. If you're going to do a startup, be prepared to fail. You know, when I was in Silicon Valley, you know, a lot of people were they were hit by the startup fever. What I was told is that you're not really serious unless you've failed a couple of times. And failing is important because in failing in these startups, you learn a lot about how to run these things. And by the time you're doing your 3rd or your 4th startup, you probably have enough experience to succeed, you know, the 3rd or 4th time. So, you know, failing in a startup is a kind of a badge of honor. It is not at all seen in a negative light. In fact, people kind of wonder, well, it's not that usual to do a startup once and then actually succeed in it. Most people have done a number of different things before they finally hit on something that actually works. I think, for example, here's an example. And this is not a tech startup, but I think in the apparel industry, there was one company, I think it was like Forever 21. I think that person who founded Forever 21, let me explain what Forever 21 is. It's actually, they sell clothing, you know, I think mostly for women, but I guess there's some clothing also for men. But it's doing pretty well. I think it's valued in the billions of dollars now. But the person who started Forever 21, I think, did a number of different businesses. One time it's starting like a coffee business, and that didn't really work. I think he even started off maybe being a janitor to start off with, but he did a number of different businesses, including doing a coffee shop, and failing a number of times before he finally decided, well, maybe I'll just start a clothing business, clothing retail business, and started Forever 21. And then I think that a while back, you know, he had said, well, he had only had maybe 4 or 5 stores, and he had said, well, I think I'm going to expand this thing so that I have like at least 50 or 60 stores. And so sure enough, you know, maybe about 10 years later, this whole retail business got to be way more than 50 or 60 retail stores. I mean, it's all over the place now. And so I think that, you know, you have to fail a number of times in several different businesses, try a number of different things often before you're successful that one time. So go to the next slide. And you have to have a certain mentality. I mean, you have to be almost eternally optimistic when and be able to accept a lot of no's and a lot of naysaying. And at the same time, you have to be realistic too, because if it gets to a point where the business really is not going to work, then you have to be able to cut your losses. But that's a very delicate balance. And of course, you have to be persistent, because there's always going to be issues when you do a startup. So it's a big balance. It's like, well, tell me, when should I quit? And it's hard to know when you should quit and when you should not quit. And yet you have to be realistic, because if it's really not doable, then you should just shutter your business and go on to something else. The other thing too is that if you're doing your own startup, it requires a lot of self-direction and self-starting, which means that you wake up in the morning and nobody tells you what to do. You have to say, okay, today I'm going to be doing this and this and this. You have your list, and you have to give yourself direction, which is quite different than working in a company, like Medtronic or Boston Scientific, where somebody actually tells you what you're supposed to do every single day, and then you maybe sort of execute what that goal is or that project is. But in a startup, nobody tells you what to do. You have to come up with what you're supposed to do, what the objective is, and then you have to, of course, execute. So you have to be self-starting, and if you're not a self-starter, maybe a startup isn't for you. The other thing is you have to have a high tolerance to ambiguity, because a lot of times in business, it's a truism. 2 + 2 doesn't always equal 4. Sometimes 1 + 2 equals 4. And that's kind of hard for some people. It doesn't always make sense. There's a lot of ambiguity, and you have to be able to tolerate that. So the 3 things you really need in a startup is, 1, you need to have a good concept or idea. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't have a really good idea, and they go into it and they find out later that it just doesn't work. You must have a good idea or concept. You have to have a really good team. Usually you can't do a startup by yourself. You have to put together a good team, maybe a good partner to begin with. And a lot of times, that makes or breaks the startup. I mean, if you have a good idea but you don't have a big team to execute it, it's not going to work. And sometimes you yourself have to be in a position to take the risk and accept failure. So I told you that sometimes you have to fail like a number of times. If you're not in a position to fail, then maybe you can't do a startup, and you shouldn't do a startup. So if you can't accept failure, and that's something that you can't work with, not in your makeup, then again, you probably don't want to do a startup. The other thing is that you have to have money. You have to have access to capital. So you're going to have to get money at some point, either through venture capital, or you have to get angels, or you have to have your own money. And that's always a truism. So how do you make sure that you get capital? Well, do the other 3 things very well. Like, have a really good idea, have a really good team, and so then you're able to maybe get capital. Because if you have a good idea and a good team, someone's going to be interested in funding your business. Okay, next slide. All right, just to summarize, what's the upsides for a startup? What's the downside? Well, let's start with the downsides. In a startup, you have a risk of failure. I mean, you can fail a couple of times, and then you might even lose some of the investment that you put in of your own money. And of course, you're putting in time. You lose time too. But at the same time, maybe you're gaining experience. That's sort of an upside. The other thing, it's all consuming. If you are not able to devote a lot of time to your startup, it may not work. I mean, if you have a family, for example, you may end up neglecting your family. So maybe the best time to do a startup is when you're young, when you can actually fail a number of times and it's still okay. If you start a startup later on and it's your first startup, and you got a family and you got a mortgage, you're probably not going to be able to do it because it's all consuming. You may not have time for your family. You may not have the funds, and you may not be able to take the failure. The upside, of course, is that you create a company, you create a product, and depending on what startup it is, you can have unlimited earning potential. So, those are the upsides. Okay, next slide. Oh, sorry, go back to the previous slide. Okay. So a medical device startup, however, is quite different than a lot of startups. Like, the startups that are like web-related, internet-related, a lot of those can have a pretty short time span before you're up and running because, if you're doing an application for your iPhone, you can maybe create something like that in 6 months if you're a good programmer. If you're doing an internet company, maybe it'll take longer because you have to acquire customers. But again, you could maybe do something in maybe a year or 2 years and get something up and running. As long as you get those programmers, put up that website. The time span from the start of the thing and into a real business where you're actually making a profit can be pretty short. But in medical devices, it can take a long time. It can take up to 6 to 10 years to actually get to a point where you go to an IPO or get bought out by another large company like Medtronic or Boston Scientific, which is the exit strategy. These days, I think the exit strategy that's preferred is to get bought out by a larger company such as Medtronic or Boston Scientific or Johnson & Johnson or some other company. The other thing too, because it takes a long time, it's going to require a lot of money. Well, why does it require such a long time? If you're doing like a class 3 medical device, such as an implantable, like a pacemaker, or a spinal cord stimulator, or a heart valve, those things require FDA approval, and you have to do clinical trials. And clinical trials can take 2 to 3 years to complete. And if it doesn't work, you might have to do another clinical trial. And they're very expensive. The clinical trials can be as expensive as the engineering development time that might have taken 2, 3, 4, 5 years to develop your product. Then on top of that, you have to tack on the FDA approval process, which can be, another several years at least. The U.S. approval process is very, very, I think it's difficult. Because of that, a lot of the clinical trials now are being done in Europe, where I think it's a little bit less long and maybe a little less onerous. They do the clinical trials in Europe, and I think they get data for FDA submission as well. And then they, after the European trials are done, they come into the United States, and then they do the FDA trials in the U.S. at the second phase. But because it takes so long, it requires a lot of capital. And one of the things that Alfred Mann, who I mentioned before, who started those 3 companies, and by the way, he was a billionaire, he said that the 3 things that are required for a medical device startup are capital, capital, and capital. So he wasn't mentioning things like a good idea, a good team, and whatever. He was saying that you need lots of money. And so the entry barriers are pretty large. If you don't have money, you can't do a medical device startup. So that said, I talked a lot about starting a medical device company. Maybe the easier thing to do is to join a medical device startup as an employee. All right, next slide. All right, I'm going to go through it real quick because I only got like about 6 minutes, and I want to spend a little time to answer any questions you might have. But yeah, don't spend all your time studying. Don't get yourself holed up in a library. But I know that's kind of difficult because at Hopkins, at least more than 30 years ago, the course load was pretty demanding. Pretty hard to actually have a lot of free time to do anything outside of studying. But anyways, have a good mix of technical courses and humanities courses to the extent you can. Well, I think they do that for you now because, I don't know that you have that much leeway on what humanities courses, but try to do a good job of picking courses that make you write and think and maybe do some presentations, because that's going to be helpful later on. Do some activities that requires collaboration and teamwork. Sometimes certain college, like, you know, maybe 30 years ago, I don't know what it's like now, but 30 years ago, you could literally just sit in the library and not talk to anybody. And there wasn't that much collaboration in doing problem sets. But in a work environment, it's all collaboration, it's all teamwork. So you must learn how to do that. Improve your EQ, you know, rather than to wait 30 years and sort of like learn by trial and error, try to pinpoint areas that you can improve on, like, immediately. The other thing, finally, is to be generous and helpful to others. And I'm not just saying that because it's like a platitude, but it really will help you, because being generous and helpful to others is like, if you think about a bank account, you're putting deposits into the bank account for withdrawal later on, you know, when you need it, you know, saving a little bit. Well, it's the same thing here. It's the same concept. If you help others while you're, you know, working, it's a lot easier to go to them and get help from them when you need it. I mean, that's not to say they won't give you help. You know, if you ask people, you're probably going to get help if you're, you know, nice about it. But they're willing, you know, other people will be willing to help you a lot more if you've actually helped them, and you're kind of withdrawing your deposits for a rainy day, I suppose, when you need it. So that's why I say be generous and helpful to others. I don't know that college is always like that. I mean, I think it's possible to go through college and just think, well, I got to get the best grades I possibly can, and it's a zero-sum game or whatever. If I don't, you know, I don't need to be helping anybody else. Well, it's rarely like that, you know, in real life. Maybe a little bit more so in college, but be aware and be mindful that you should try to help people. So next slide. I think that might be the last slide. All right. Well, I'm not going to talk too much about intellectual property because I think I ran out of time. So I got 3 more minutes here. If anyone has any questions about anything I talked about or intellectual property and patents, I'm willing to answer them right now.
Okay, everyone, this is Caroline. I'm going to take everyone off of mute, so please make sure that you're either dialed in on the phone or via your computer, but not both.
Yeah, does anyone have any questions for me? Okay. I guess there's no questions, Carolyn, so maybe I'll take 2 minutes to talk about patents and intellectual property and medical devices.
Sure, that sounds great.
Okay. So for those who are thinking about careers, if you go into engineering, for example, or a science major, like a biology, chemistry, another avenue for a career is intellectual property and law. I can say right now that even 30 years ago, there was excellent opportunities to be a patent lawyer in medical devices and the pharmaceutical industry. And the reason why patent lawyers are so important is because it costs so much money to get a device approved. It takes years. Same thing with drugs. You have 1 or 2 drugs, and you have to spend literally $1 billion maybe to get a drug approved. So when you're spending $1 billion to get some drug approved, guess what? You don't want somebody to come in and be able to copy what you just did and be able to sell what you did when you just have to spend $1 billion to prove that the drug works. Same thing with medical devices. Medical devices can cost literally, I don't know, $50 to $100 million to get a system approved. So when that's the case, patents are supremely important in medical devices. So, companies like Medtronic and Boston Scientific have patent lawyers to file patent applications. Now, other industries, they also they also, you know, require patent attorneys, and right now it's pretty reasonably easy to get a job as a patent attorney. Okay, what's required? Well, you need to have an undergraduate degree in science or engineering, or you have to have taken a substantial number of courses in sciences or engineering. And then you can take the patent bar that was given by the U.S. Patent Office. And companies don't like to they won't hire you straight out of law school. You usually have to have 3 to 5 years of law experience in another firm, or in a law firm or another company. So you usually get training in a law firm. If you want to go into pharmaceuticals, you have to have usually a PhD in biological field, or maybe a master's degree, or in chemistry. So it's a little bit different there. They require you to, a lot of times, have a PhD in there, in that field. So if you're interested in, if you're good at writing, and you're interested in technology, patent law might be for you. And it's kind of good for risk-averse individuals. I mean, you know, the people who are probably patent lawyers tend to not to be too they tend to be somewhat risk-averse. I mean, a lot of them are not going to go in and do their own startups. So that's my presentation. So thank you for joining me.
So much.
Okay. So thank you for joining me, and I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, Phil. Sorry to interrupt you. Please continue.
Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you, Carolyn, for setting this up.
Great, wonderful. Well, thank you all for joining. Phil, thank you so much for contributing to Health Science this week, our first one. I think it's a very valuable presentation, and we certainly look forward to maybe having you again. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you. Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.